Golden Arches are arguably the most recognized architectural silhouette on the planet, a beacon of standardized commerce that spans continents and cultures. Yet, behind the cheerful branding and billions of burgers served lies a corporate genesis story defined not by harmonious partnership, but by a brutal collision of contrasting visions. The empire that redefined global eating habits was born from a revolutionary idea, but the men who actually conceived it were systematically erased from their own legacy. This is a saga of brilliant innovation hijacked by relentless ambition, where the true cost of scaling a dream was the total surrender of the dreamers. To understand the magnitude of this corporate usurpation, one must look back to the post-war American landscape. The late 1940s heralded the explosion of car culture, and with it, the rise of the drive-in restaurant. These early establishments were chaotic ecosystems of teenage car hops, sprawling menus, and agonizingly slow service. Quality control was practically non-existent, and profit margins were routinely devoured by high overhead and rampant operational inefficiency. Richard and Maurice McDonald, operating a moderately successful drive-in in San Bernardino, California, recognized that this conventional model was fundamentally broken. The brothers were not just cooks, they were ruthless pragmatists who viewed the commercial kitchen through the lens of industrial engineering. They made the audacious decision to shut down their highly profitable business for 3 months to completely reimagine the mechanical flow of food preparation. When the shutters finally reopened, the brothers unveiled their revolutionary Speedee Service System. They had stripped the menu down to a mere 9 essential items, eliminating the need for specialized chefs and sprawling inventory. More importantly, they applied the rigorous logic of the factory assembly line to the kitchen, designing custom dispensers that delivered exact increments of ketchup and mustard and replacing skilled cooks with specialized, highly repetitive labor. The operational masterpiece they engineered was a paradigm shift in the restaurant industry. A customer could walk up to the window and receive a hot, perfectly uniform hamburger in 15 seconds for precisely 15 cents. The San Bernardino location became a localized phenomenon, generating massive profits and drawing lines that snaked around the block. The brothers had achieved their ultimate goal, securing a highly lucrative, easily manageable business that afforded them a comfortable, stress-free life under the California sun. 2,000 miles away in Illinois, a 52-year-old traveling salesman named Ray Kroc was experiencing a very different reality. Kroc was peddling 5-spindle milkshake machines, a grueling existence defined by endless highways, cheap motels, and rapidly fading prospects. He was a man running out of time, desperate for a singular, transformative opportunity to validate a lifetime of relentless hustle and near misses. That opportunity materialized in the form of an anomalous purchase order. When Kroc noticed that a single restaurant out west was operating 8 of his multi-mixers simultaneously, his professional curiosity morphed into a feverish obsession. He boarded a flight to the West Coast, entirely unprepared for the sheer scale of the revelation awaiting him in the San Bernardino desert. Standing in the dusty parking lot, Kroc watched the Speedee Service System in motion and experienced an almost spiritual awakening. While Richard and Maurice saw a perfect, self-contained money machine that provided local financial security, Kroc saw the undeniable blueprint for an unprecedented national empire. The fundamental tragedy of the McDonald's Corporation was forged in this exact pivotal moment of divergent perception. Kroc relentlessly pitched himself to the cautious brothers, eventually securing the rights to act as their exclusive national franchise agent. The resulting contract, however, was a masterclass in restrictive foresight by the founders. Richard and Maurice demanded absolute ironclad control over every operational detail of the franchise locations, requiring all proposed changes to be submitted in writing and approved via registered mail. They wanted the passive profits of expansion without sacrificing the pristine purity of their original creation. As Kroc began opening locations across the American Midwest, the suffocating reality of the San Bernardino Agreement quickly choked his grand ambitions. His franchise fee structure was disastrously thin, leaving him practically bankrupt despite the booming popularity of the new restaurants. He was building a fast food empire brick by brick, yet he could barely afford to pay his own secretary. The friction between Illinois and California rapidly escalated into outright hostility. When Kroc pleaded for minor operational adjustments to survive the harsh Midwestern winters, such as moving the boilers indoors, the brothers routinely ignored his letters or flatly denied his requests. The founders remained comfortably isolated in their original success, entirely detached from the existential financial terror consuming their franchise agent. The echoes of that initial contract became a psychological prison for Kroc, binding him to men who lacked his insatiable hunger for scale. The trajectory of the entire enterprise hinged on a single, brilliant, strategic pivot conceived by a financial genius named Harry Sonneborn. Reviewing Kroc's dismal corporate ledgers, Sonneborn delivered a revelation that permanently altered the landscape of modern business. He coldly informed Kroc that he was entirely misinterpreting his own company. He was not fundamentally in the food business, he was in the real estate business. This profound insight birthed the Franchise Realty Corporation. Instead of merely selling the right to use the San Bernardino system, Kroc's newly formed entity began aggressively purchasing or leasing the physical land beneath the prospective restaurants. He would then lease that highly desirable land back to the franchisees at a substantial markup, alongside a mandatory percentage of their gross monthly sales. The introduction of this real estate model was a devastating corporate masterstroke. It provided Kroc with a massive, reliable revenue stream that was entirely independent of the restrictive franchise contract he had signed years earlier. More crucially, it granted him absolute, unyielding leverage over his operators. If a franchisee failed to adhere to his exacting standards, he could simply evict them from the property. The power dynamic, once firmly held by the founders in California, violently inverted. Armed with newfound capital and an unyielding desire for total autonomy, Kroc's tolerance for the brothers' constant interference evaporated entirely. By 1961, the relationship had deteriorated into a toxic swamp of resentment and legal threats. Kroc demanded a complete and total buyout, forcing Richard and Maurice to name their final price for the entirety of the company they had birthed. The brothers, weary of the relentless conflict and perfectly content with their accumulated wealth, demanded $2.7 million. It was a sum carefully calculated to leave them exactly $1 million each after taxes. Kroc was infuriated by the exorbitant figure, viewing it as a final act of extortion by men who lacked his visionary courage. Nevertheless, he secured the massive funding through a complex network of high-interest loans, driven by a singular, consuming desire to sever the brothers from the corporate entity forever. The buyout agreement, however, contained a catastrophic vulnerability that would seal the founders' ultimate fate. During the tense negotiations, the brothers stubbornly insisted on retaining ownership of their original San Bernardino location, wishing to leave it to their longtime employees. Kroc, enraged by this final stipulation, verbally agreed to give them a percentage of future corporate profits to smooth over the deal, but strictly refused to put the royalty agreement in writing, citing complex complications with his East Coast financiers. That handshake deal was a calculated, devastating deception. Once the ink dried on the $2.7 million buyout, Kroc immediately reneged on the verbal royalty promise, permanently depriving the founders of what would have eventually become hundreds of millions of dollars in passive income. The ethical breach was absolute, and the financial ramifications for the brothers' descendants were staggering. The cruelty of the corporate takeover extended far beyond mere financial exclusion. Because Kroc now legally owned the exclusive trademark rights to their very surname, Richard and Maurice were legally barred from calling their original, beloved restaurant McDonald's. In a humiliating twist of corporate law, they were forced to rebrand the absolute birthplace of the fast food industry as the Big M. Kroc's vengeance was meticulous, patient, and absolute. He deliberately purchased the lot directly across the street from the Big M and opened a gleaming, brand-new franchise, weaponizing the brothers' own operational masterpiece against them. Unable to compete with the corporate juggernaut bearing their own stolen name, the founders were steadily driven out of business, closing their doors just a few years later. The erasure of Richard and Maurice was then systematically codified into corporate lore. As Kroc rapidly ascended to the absolute pinnacle of American capitalism, he aggressively rewrote the company's history. He designated his first franchised location in Des Plaines, Illinois, as the official store number 1, framing himself not as the opportunistic salesman who bought the company, but as its sole visionary creator. The legacy of this monumental corporate takeover is a haunting testament to the ruthless realities of scaling a global enterprise. The Golden Arches stand today as an enduring monument to Ray Kroc's unparalleled ambition and Harry Sonneborn's financial brilliance, but their foundations rest heavily upon the hijacked genius of two quiet brothers from New Hampshire. Richard and Maurice McDonald fundamentally revolutionized the way the world eats. Yet their ultimate, tragic reward was to become a forgotten footnote in the shadow of the empire that still bears their name.